Hi, thank you so much for doing an interview. Would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Patrick Fielding. I've been listening to what is now called EDM. Back in the day, it was just called electronic music since late, mid to late 90s, from the very start of like where the underground um, rave scene in the Bay Area, where I moved to when I was 14, where you would get a flyer, there would be a phone number on the flyer, you would have to call an hour before the start of the show to get the actual location. Was what it was like when I first started going. Then I had moved out here in the early 2000s. My cousin's boyfriend Seth, so vocal, was a local drum and bass MC here in Rochester. And a lot of my cousin Katie's friends were drum and bass DJs. So we were always doing warehouse parties, basement rave, all sorts of different stuff.
That's really neat. So, what first drew you to EDM?
Um, actually, it was just my love for beats. I mean, like I grew up with a lot of music in my life, everything from like classic rock, but mostly it was the fact that I played percussion.
Oh, that's cool. So, how did you become involved in the EDM scene, going to shows and everything?
It it's kind of weird. I was thinking about that. Like it just I'm trying to think of the right word. Organically happened. I didn't seek it out, but when I found it, I was like, I like this. Like I like the scene. I like back then Plural was just starting, the peace, love, unity, respect. Um, it was just more of a welcoming group of people because I was the heavy set fat kid in high school and I always got pushed to the side. But when I started going to EDM shows and everybody was treating me the same, like it was more of the sense of community.
That's so cool. So, could you describe the shows, what and the people, what they were like when you were going to raves in the Bay Area?
Geez, I've been um, okay, where do I start? Because my first ever rave I went to was in a warehouse that I was 16 at the time. I cannot tell you exactly where it was in San Francisco, but my friend's older brother was like, "Hey, you guys want to go to see a show?" And it was a warehouse party in the middle of an industrial area, and Paul Oakenfold was playing,
Oh, wow.
and it was only $5.
That's crazy. For Oakenfold.
And then and it progressed from there, from going to warehouse shows to actually going to the when we were able to get fake IDs. We would actually go to actually like actual clubs. Um, and then when I moved back to my mom's house when I was 17, that was in the western part of Colorado in the desert. That's more of where I went to see a lot of trance DJs that would just set up out west. They have what's called BLM, which is the Bureau of Land Management, which is public land. So folks would go out tens of miles out into the desert and throw pallet raves where there'd be a huge bonfire, someone would be playing music, and you would see it off from the distance. And if you were local, you would know how to get there.
Wow, that's
And
amazing.
then when I moved out here, it was a lot of shows were at Water Street Music Hall. Um, so it's I've been to every kind of rave you could possibly think of. It's
So the venues definitely changed. Do you feel like that changed the culture or the type of people you were seeing at the raves at all?
yeah. Now that the EDM artists are playing mostly at exclusive Vegas places or at like places like Coachella or um uh like places and festivals where you have to have a $500 ticket to even get in, on top of everything else. It's become quite commodified, as to
Yeah.
where before you could just go to a warehouse and see it. I mean,
You
there's still some
know,
of that going on, but not as much as there used to be.
of course. And then back then, do you feel like the culture was more regional as well? Like between, although Colorado and Rochester and San Francisco are going to have different venues, did you feel like the people and the culture you were seeing was different between those places as well?
In the rave community, no, it was pretty fluid. The Like I said, I don't know. I haven't been to one in over 20 years, so I don't know if the plural community is still strong in the rave scene anymore. But that was a blanket from the trance to the hard house to the acid house to happy hardcore to drum and bass to jungle to dubs, like or uh not dubstep, but jump up. It was pretty welcoming across the board from my experiences.
That's so cool. Do you feel like there was an element of modification or a commercial element to the shows you were going to in the 90s?
No, no, not really, because they were like, the DJ board was on a board sitting on top of milk crates with household Kenwood speakers for the sound system. Um, Maybe you get somebody with a fog machine, but it wasn't really. It was pretty. How do I say it? Home brewed, kind of.
Milk crate, that's really getting creative there. Yeah, so were you how did you find out about shows typically? Was it always the phone line? And were these at all paid events?
It, because back then the internet wasn't very didn't exist really, so it was flyers and music. Like, see, like there's places in like Berkeley that people would post flyers, and record stores and stuff. That's how you would have to word of mouth, because there wasn't no Facebook or any Instagram or anything to post events on.
Gotcha. Makes sense. So, do you feel like commodification has added, taken away from, or changed the scene? Kind of why?
It's weird. It's added and changed at the same time.
So, what do you think it's added? What do you think it's changed?
It's like I said before, it's become more for the elite. It's become elitist almost, unless you have a a, a local scene, underground scene, and but you have to have money to go see EDM nowadays. Like, if you live in a town that doesn't have a scene, you have to pay uh high ticket prices to go see somebody.
Do you feel like it's created more accessibility though? Because, not necessarily everybody would have had an underground scene even in the 90s.
Um, and just so I can get a point, I'm just trying to make sure I'm thinking of this correctly. Like, when you say commodification, do you mean like Spotify and SoundCloud and stuff like that? Or more of the commodification of looking at music as only a money making thing, instead of doing it for the love of music?
So, I mean, more in the sense of commodification of the scene, like talking about the shows you go to and the events and the community that you'd interact with at those events.
Yeah.
So, just
Okay.
less like the music itself and more like the culture and the shows around it.
Yeah. It's kind of hard to put it. I really didn't think about that. Like that. That's a good question to think. I mean, if it wasn't for the commodification, because like a lot of folks had to leave here because they couldn't make a living doing it because the underground scene wasn't big enough. Um, added to them being able to continue their DJing careers into their 40s. So yes, in that aspect, it's helped. It's helped.
Yeah, so it's stretched it beyond youth culture into something you can do your whole life.
Yeah.
That's neat. That's a cool perspective. I haven't heard that before. Yeah. So that was kind of the questions I had. Was there any more details you wanted to share
Um.
about the scenes you were in, or especially the Rochester scene? Because that's not something I've been able to get a lot of sources about.
Um. For me, it was a brief. I wasn't super involved. I was only here for 2 years before I moved to Syracuse. But the Rochester scene back then was just every weekend there was multiple, like Tilt would have trance night going on, and then around the corner at Water Street someone would be having a party with a different genre. So and like you could every weekend you could go to a rave if you wanted to.
Yeah. I guess for somebody who's learning Rochester's buildings, would that be more in the club or more like in a concert hall type
um
situation?
Water Street is a club and a music hall. So Tilt at the time was a club, so it was both club and music halls.
Cool.
Because I don't know if you've ever been to Water Street Music Hall, but one side is a music hall and the other side is like a club. So they have both things.
Gotcha. That's kind of a
Like
neat setup.
one of the biggest parties I've ever been to in Rochester was Paul or LTJ Bookham was playing at Water Street. He was playing the venue side. Then on the club side, they had a house DJ headlining there, and then there's a basement that they had um the dark and ambient drum and bass going on, and then behind that was another room where they had happy hardcore going. So they would have multiple genres of EDM all in the same venue, which was really cool.
That's neat. So I guess my last question is, did you have any trouble with licensing or law enforcement at the
Um,
time?
back then, no, because there was no way really for the the police to find out.
Mm.
Because like how we said in the beginning, like I said in the beginning of the interview, you didn't know the venue until an hour before, and usually they were in industrial areas where there's not going to be issues. Whereas now today with social media, people post stuff online, and the cops could will find out about it, and no one was really too worried about licensing back then either. That wasn't never an issue. They would
Gotcha.
just they would just rent a warehouse, and it was like don't ask, don't tell. The owners wouldn't ask what was going on, and the promoters wouldn't say what they were doing, kind of thing. I think it's called that
Very cool.
committal liability, or I forget what it's called.
Interesting. Do you feel like not necessarily being able to fly under the radar like that and not having those kinds of spaces accessible to you today has changed the scene at all?
No, I mean, look at Steve Aoki. I mean, he's selling 50,000 people stadiums out, so it's actually kind of made it safer too, because some of the places that I've been into raves should not have been having people in them. In one aspect, like one rave we went to, it was in a two-story complex, and it collapsed because the weight of the people dancing.
Oh my goodness. What happened? How did people react?
Well, it didn't, like, it wasn't a catastrophic collapse, but like the floor like sunk
Oh
in, and everybody just evacuated because
my goodness.
it was in an old warehouse over behind Nick Tahoe's.
Oh, oh yeah, geez. That's wild. Did anything happen with the promoter or did you guys just kind of move on?
It, it was underground. And back then there was really no um lawsuits weren't a thing back then. Promoters didn't have to worry too much about getting sued. That
Interesting.
really was that wasn't really an issue
Yeah.
as it is nowadays, where you the release of liability on the back of your ticket is longer almost than the ticket.
No. Well, thank you so much. That's some really interesting perspective. I hadn't heard a lot of that before. Do you have any thoughts you'd like to share before we stop recording?
Um, it's just been really interesting to see how the EDM scene has grown, how there's been new genres within that have been being developed, and being an old head in this, it's nice to see that kids are still enjoying the music.
Absolutely. Alrighty, thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and
You're
start
welcome.